Hey there, and welcome to Dark Creaky TV. If you're new, hit that subscribe button for spine-tingling Reddit creepypasta stories that are perfect for a night of chilling thrills. Don't forget to share your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and let's get into tonight's stories. The Ouija board gave us a safe word. We didn't say it in time. Okay, so I'm not really the type to believe in ghosts, spirits, or any of that supernatural stuff. I always thought those stories were just for people who wanted to freak themselves out. But this was different. And if I could go back, I would have just called it a night and watched Netflix. But no, I had to be the idiot that got curious. This all started a few weeks ago. My buddy Jake and I were hanging out in my apartment, just goofing around on the internet. We'd had a couple of beers, and Jake got this brilliant idea. Why not mess around with a Ouija board? Now Jake's always been into weird stuff. If there's a dark corner of the web, he's probably poked around in it, usually just to see what's there. I didn't think much of it. Ouija boards, to me, were just a goofy little game, something kids used at sleepovers to scare each other. But Jake had that look in his eye. You know, that look when someone's excited, but you can tell they're hiding a little fear behind it. He said he found a website on the deep web, a place where they sold enhanced Ouija boards. I told him he was an idiot, but he waved his phone at me, showing some weird website with a black background and crimson text. The board was supposed to be more responsive, whatever that meant. Yeah, okay, buddy, I thought. But curiosity got the better of me, and the next thing I knew, we'd ordered it. About a week later, this old beat-up box showed up at my door. No return address, just a stamp that looked like it had seen better days. Inside was a wooden Ouija board, nothing special at first glance, except instead of the regular yes, no, and alphabet printed on it, there was something else at the bottom, a single word burned into the wood: harvest. Jake thought it was cool, but I wasn't so sure. I mean, harvest. What was that supposed to mean? We laughed it off, figuring it was just some edgy joke from whoever made it. But we were bored, and maybe a little too buzzed to care. We decided to try it out that night. We turned off the lights, lit a couple of candles. Yeah, super cliche, I know. And set the board between us on my coffee table. Now here's where things started to feel off. Jake pulled out the planchette and placed it on the board. The thing was ice cold, like it had been sitting in a freezer. It wasn't cold outside, and my apartment's never been chilly. But the second we put our hands on that thing, I swear the temperature dropped. You ever get that feeling, like the air gets heavy and your ears start to ring, but there's no sound? That's what it felt like. We started with the usual questions. Is anyone there? Can you give us a sign? Expecting nothing. And at first, that's exactly what we got. But then Jake, half joking, asked, "What's the safe word?" The planchette moved, just a little twitch, like someone tapping your shoulder lightly. We both froze and looked at each other. He asked if I moved it, and I swore up and down that I hadn't. Jake was all in now, eyes wide like a kid on Christmas. He asked again, "What's the safe word?" The planchette slid slowly, scraping against the wood with this awful, grating noise. C-A-V-E. It spelled out C-A-V-E. Weird, right? I asked if that was some kind of joke, but Jake looked just as confused as I was. Cave? What the hell does that mean? I muttered. Jake shrugged, but he was smiling like he'd just found buried treasure. He started asking more questions, but I noticed something he didn't. My breath was coming out in short, misty puffs, like it does when you're outside in the winter. But it was summer, in my living room. I told Jake we should stop, but he ignored me, leaning into the board like it was about to reveal some great mystery. He asked who we were speaking to, and the planchette moved again, faster this time. N-O-T-A-L-O-N-E. Jake tried to laugh it off. He said, "Oh, so you've got friends?" Cool. He was trying to be brave, but I could hear the shake in his voice, and that's when it hit me. This didn't feel like a game anymore. There was this pressure in the room, like we were being watched. I could feel something just out of sight, something that was there, just beyond the candlelight. Jake was ready to keep going, but I insisted we stop. I reached for the planchette to move it to goodbye, like you're supposed to do when you end these things properly. But before I could, the planchette moved again. This time, it didn't spell anything. It just slid over to that word burned into the board. Harvest. We both jerked our hands back like we'd been burned. The planchette sat there, vibrating slightly, like something was trying to keep it in place. Jake tried to brush it off, but he couldn't hide the tremble in his hands. Must have been a draft or something, he mumbled. Yeah, right. A draft that moves a piece of wood on its own. We shut the board and stashed it back in its box, but the weirdness didn't end there. That night, I kept waking up every couple of hours, drenched in sweat despite the AC running, and there was this sound, like scratching against wood, coming from the closet where we'd put the board. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. Jake called me the next morning, voice hushed. He said he thought he saw something moving outside his window last night, a shadow that disappeared the second he tried to get a better look. We agreed not to mess with the board again, but it was too late. Whatever we'd invited in, it wasn't leaving without something. A couple of days went by, and I tried my best to forget about that night. Jake and I didn't talk about it much, but I could tell he was spooked too. He kept glancing over his shoulder like he was expecting to see something creeping up behind him. I didn't blame him. Every time I walked by that closet where we'd stashed the board, I felt this strange pull, like I should take it out again, just to check if it was still there. But I resisted. The memory of that cold, heavy air, and that word, harvest, kept me from doing anything stupid. But then things started getting weirder. The noises at night didn't stop. Scratches, taps, like a stray animal trying to claw its way in. At first I thought it might be mice, but when I checked, the closet was empty. No holes, no signs of anything. Just that old, splintered box sitting in the corner. One night I woke up around 3 a.m. I know, cliché, right? But I swear it's always 3 a.m. when the weird stuff happens. My phone buzzed on the nightstand, and it was a text from Jake. "Are you seeing this?" I stared at the message, groggy and confused. I shot back a reply. "Seeing what?" A few seconds later, he sent a photo. It was dark and grainy, but I could make out the silhouette of a person standing outside his apartment window, barely illuminated by a streetlight. They were just standing there. No face, no details, just a shadowy outline. "Dude, that's not funny," I texted back, assuming he was trying to mess with me. But then, my phone started buzzing like crazy. He was calling me. When I picked up, I could hear the panic in his voice. "They've been out there for an hour. They're not moving, man. I don't know what to do. I've called the cops, but they haven't shown up yet. What if it's, from that night?" I tried to keep calm, but my stomach was twisting into knots. "Just stay inside. Don't do anything stupid, okay? They're probably just some creep trying to scare you." But even as I said it, I knew it wasn't true. I glanced out my own window, half expecting to see someone lurking outside. But the street below was empty, only shadows shifting in the breeze. I kept the phone by my ear, listening to Jake's shallow breathing, until he finally whispered, "They're gone." Relief washed over me, but it didn't last long. Because the next night, the same thing happened to me. I woke up to that feeling, like when you can tell someone's watching you, even with your eyes closed. I tried to ignore it, but then I heard it, a faint tap, tapping on my window. I turned over slowly, my heart in my throat, and there, just outside the window, I saw it, a shadow, tall and thin, with limbs too long, like they'd been stretched out. The streetlight behind it barely lit up its outline, but that was enough. Its head twitched to one side, almost curious, and then it raised a hand. A long, bony finger tapped the glass 3 times. Tap, tap, tap. before melting back into the darkness. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on the edge of my bed with the lights on, gripping a baseball bat like that would do anything against whatever that thing was. When morning came, I called Jake. He sounded rough, like he hadn't slept either. "I think it's the board," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I think we let something out, man. We need to get rid of it." I couldn't agree fast enough. That afternoon, Jake came over, looking worse than I'd ever seen him. His eyes were bloodshot, and he kept rubbing his hands together like he couldn't warm them up. We pulled the box out of the closet, and when I lifted the lid, a stench hit me, like rotting leaves and damp earth. The board was covered in scratches that hadn't been there before, lines carved deep into the wood like something had been clawing at it from the inside. We decided to take it to the woods near my place and bury it. Yeah, I know. Dumb horror movie move, right? But at that point, we were desperate. The board felt heavier than before, like it didn't want to be moved. We drove out to the woods, barely talking, just this awful silence between us. When we reached a clearing, we dug a hole, deep enough that it wouldn't be found by some unlucky dog or hiker. I held the board over the hole, but before I could drop it in, Jake froze. His eyes went wide, staring past me, into the trees. "Do you see that?" he whispered, voice shaking. I turned slowly, my heart hammering in my chest. At first, I didn't see anything, just shadows stretching between the trees. But then something shifted. A shape moved, blending into the darkness, just out of sight. It wasn't human, too tall, too thin, like the thing I'd seen outside my window. It stood there, motionless, and then, in that same horrible, deliberate way, it raised a finger and pointed directly at Jake. "Drop it!" Jake hissed, his voice barely a croak. I didn't need to be told twice. I shoved the board into the hole and started piling dirt on top of it. My hands were shaking so bad I nearly dropped the shovel. But then, as the last bit of dirt covered the board, that cold weight in the air vanished. We stared at the mound of dirt for a few seconds, our breaths coming out in ragged gasps. "Do you think that worked?" I asked, not really expecting an answer. Jake shook his head. "I don't know, man, but we should get out of here." We practically ran back to the car, glancing over our shoulders every few steps, but whatever had been out there was gone. I tried to convince myself that it was over, that we'd buried whatever curse that board had brought. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. As we drove away, Jake muttered under his breath, "Cave. Harvest. What does any of this mean?" I didn't answer him, because I didn't want to admit that I had a feeling the worst was still to come. Burying the board should have been the end of it. That's what we told ourselves on the drive back. But a couple of days later, things started getting worse. I mean, it was like the board might be gone, but whatever we'd stirred up was still around, and it wasn't happy about being ignored. It started with the nightmares. Every night, I'd find myself back in those woods, the air thick with fog, the trees stretching taller than they should. I'd be standing over that same spot where we buried the board, but instead of dirt, there was this gaping black hole in the ground, like the earth had just caved in. And from inside, I could hear a whisper. No, a chant, something low and rhythmic, like a voice dragging over gravel. I could never make out the words, but I'd wake up with my heart pounding, drenched in sweat, and that same word rattling in my mind. Cave. I didn't tell Jake about the dreams, but I had a feeling he was dealing with his own stuff. He started avoiding my calls, wouldn't answer the door when I dropped by. When I finally caught him at his place, he looked even worse than before. His eyes had these deep bags under them, and he flinched at every little sound, like he was expecting something to jump out at him. "Are you still seeing things?" I asked, trying to sound casual, like we weren't both losing our minds. He just nodded, staring out his window like he expected that shadow to be waiting there again. "They won't leave me alone," he whispered, almost like he was talking to himself. "It's like they're trying to tell me something, but I don't understand what they want." That chilled me. The idea that whatever we'd seen was still hanging around, watching us, waiting for us to make a move. I didn't know what else to do, so I went back to the woods the next day. I thought maybe I could find that spot, dig the board back up, burn it, throw the ashes in a river. Something. But when I got there, the clearing looked different. The ground where we'd buried the board wasn't just disturbed, it was gone, like someone had scooped out a chunk of earth, leaving behind this jagged pit about the size of a coffin. I stepped closer, peering into the hole, expecting to see the board at the bottom, but it wasn't there. It was just empty. And that's when I heard it again, that low, rumbling whisper, like wind pushing through a narrow tunnel. I don't know why I did it. Maybe it was instinct, or maybe I just wanted to prove to myself that I was imagining things. But I leaned down, trying to make out the sound. It was coming from deep in the hole, like a voice echoing up from the darkness. And then, clear as day, I heard a word. Cave! I jumped back, nearly tripping over my own feet. My hands were shaking so bad I dropped my flashlight, and the beam swung wildly across the trees, casting these weird, warped shadows. I didn't bother picking it up. I just ran back to the car, not daring to look back. When I got home, I tried to call Jake, but he didn't pick up. I drove to his place, pounded on his door until my knuckles were sore, but no luck. That's when I noticed the window, his living room window, where he'd seen that figure before. It was open, wide open, curtains fluttering in the wind. I let myself in, calling his name, but the place was dead silent. I walked through each room, feeling that same heaviness in the air, like the atmosphere was pressing in around me. The last place I checked was the basement. Jake never went down there. He always said it gave him the creeps, which made sense. It was dark, damp, and the kind of place where every creak echoed like a scream. But the basement door was open, and when I called out again, my voice bounced back at me, empty and hollow. I took a deep breath, gripping my phone like a flashlight, and stepped down into the darkness. Halfway down the stairs, I saw him. Jake was standing at the far end of the basement, his back to me, his head tilted up toward the ceiling. For a second, I almost felt relieved. But then I noticed his posture. His arms were hanging at his sides, loose, like he wasn't really in control of them. And the way he was standing, it was unnatural, rigid, like something was holding him up. I called out to him again, but he didn't turn around, just kept staring at the ceiling. And that's when I heard it, faint, but unmistakable. That same whisper, leaking out from the shadows, wrapping around us like a cold wind. Cave! I stepped closer, the floorboards creaking under my weight, and reached out to touch his shoulder. But the second my fingers brushed against him, he snapped his head around. His eyes were wide, bloodshot, filled with this wild, panicked look. He grabbed my arm with this iron grip and hissed, "We have to say it," the safe word, before it's too late. I yanked my arm back, stumbling away. "What are you talking about? We buried the board. It's over." Jake shook his head, his face pale and sweaty. "It doesn't matter. We didn't end it right. We didn't say the word. We broke the rule, and now it's still here, waiting for us. They're waiting." I tried to calm him down, but he just kept mumbling about the safe word, like it was the only thing he could focus on. Finally, I managed to drag him upstairs, but he kept looking over his shoulder, like he could see something following us. I tried to get more out of him, but he just kept repeating the same thing over and over. Cave, harvest. We have to say it. We have to say it together. He wouldn't let me leave that night, insisted that I stay with him. And honestly, I was too freaked out to argue. I crashed on his couch, but I didn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard that whisper, like it was right next to my ear. And then, sometime around 2 a.m., the power went out. The whole apartment plunged into darkness. That's when I saw it. A shadow moving across the room, slow and deliberate. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the candlelight. until I realized the candles had blown out too. Jake bolted upright, eyes wide, staring at the same spot I was. The shadow moved closer, slipping along the walls, and for a second I could see a shape. A face, pale and hollow, eyes black as coal, staring at us with this twisted, hungry expression. "Say it!" Jake hissed, grabbing my arm, his nails digging into my skin. "Say the word with me!" I tried to speak, but my mouth was dry, the words stuck in my throat. And then, as the shadow loomed closer, I finally forced it out. "Cave." The shadow froze, just inches away, its outline shifting in the dark. But Jake, he hesitated. He opened his mouth, but the word wouldn't come out. His eyes locked on the shadow, and for a split second, I saw his lips move, but no sound came. And that's when I knew. Whatever game we'd started, whatever rule we'd broken, we were out of time. The shadow hovered in the dark, a mass of shifting darkness that seemed to swallow what little light was left. I held my breath, heart pounding so hard I thought it might crack my ribs. Jake's hand was clamped around my wrist, but his grip was going slack, like all the fight had drained out of him. He still hadn't said the word. "Jake, say it," I whispered, my voice barely more than a rasp. He looked at me, his eyes wide, desperate, but it was like he couldn't find his voice. His mouth opened and closed, but the word just wouldn't come out. And then, the shadow began to move again, sliding closer, a cold chill rolling through the room with it. I could feel something pulling at me, like gravity shifting sideways, dragging me towards that darkness. My skin prickled, and my vision blurred at the edges, like I was on the verge of passing out. Jake tried to speak, his lips forming the shape of the word, but all that came out was a choked wheeze, as if something had wrapped around his throat and squeezed. I don't know what possessed me to do it. Maybe it was fear, maybe some instinct deep in my bones, but I grabbed the lighter from the coffee table, flicked it on, and held it between us and that shadow. For a second, the flame danced, throwing wild, shaky light across the room, and I swear I saw a face in that darkness. It wasn't human. Eyes like pinpricks of fire, a mouth stretched too wide, lips curled into a sneer that seemed to mock our desperation. Jake gasped, his grip tightening suddenly on my arm, his eyes locked on mine, filled with a terror I've never seen in anyone before. And then, finally, he managed to croak it out. "Cave." The shadow stilled, its form rippling like smoke caught in a gust of wind. For a moment, the air seemed to hang, suspended between breaths. I thought, maybe, just maybe, we'd done it. That the word had worked, that whatever curse we'd triggered would finally be lifted. But then the lights snapped back on, flooding the room with harsh, yellow glow. The shadow disappeared in an instant, like a mirage vanishing in the daylight. But the relief I expected didn't come. Because when I turned back to Jake, he was staring at me, his expression blank, empty, like he'd just seen something so far beyond his understanding that it had broken something inside of him. And then, before I could say anything, he collapsed. I tried to catch him, but he fell through my arms, hitting the floor with a thud that made my stomach twist. His body was limp, cold to the touch, and for one horrible second, I thought he was dead. But then I saw his chest rise, just a little. Shallow breaths, barely there. I called for an ambulance, my voice barely working, stumbling through the words. I stayed by his side until they arrived, but he never woke up. Not then. Not for a long time. The paramedics took him away, asking me a million questions I couldn't answer. What happened? What he might have taken? Why his pulse was so weak? I lied, told them he'd had some kind of panic attack, left out the whole part about shadow figures and haunted Ouija boards. What else was I supposed to say? After they left, I stood in the middle of the wrecked living room, the silence pressing in like a heavy weight. And that's when I noticed something out of place. A piece of paper, crumpled, lying half under the coffee table. I picked it up, hands still shaking, and smoothed it out. It was an old, yellowed page, torn from some kind of journal or notebook. There was writing on it, scrawled in a messy, jagged script. It looked like a kid's handwriting, but the words made my skin crawl. To speak with what lies beneath, you must give it a word. To send it back, you must take its voice away. But speak too late, and it will claim what is owed. I read it over and over, my mind racing, trying to piece it together. Take its voice away? What did that even mean? And then my stomach dropped as I realized Jake had said the word, but not in time. The shadow had gotten to him first. I spent the rest of that night pacing my apartment, replaying everything in my head. The whispers, the shadow, the board, the word we'd buried. It all fit together, like pieces of a twisted puzzle. We'd given it a voice, and then we'd tried to take it back. But we'd been too slow, and now it had taken something from us instead. The next morning, I went to the hospital to check on Jake. His parents were there, pale and confused, hovering outside his room. They told me he was in some kind of coma, though the doctors couldn't explain why. His vitals were stable, but it was like his mind had just shut off, like he'd gone somewhere else and didn't know how to find his way back. They let me see him just for a few minutes. He looked peaceful, almost like he was sleeping, but there was this deep crease between his brows, like he was struggling with something, even in his unconscious state. I whispered his name, hoping he might hear me, might wake up. But he didn't even twitch. And then, just as I was about to leave, I heard it again. That whisper, low and hissing, curling through the air like smoke. Harvest! I froze, my heart lurching in my chest. It wasn't coming from Jake's room. It was coming from down the hall, echoing off the sterile walls. I turned, but no one else seemed to hear it. The nurses and patients moved around me, oblivious, like I was the only one who could hear that awful voice. I walked down the hallway, following the sound. Each step felt like it was pulling me deeper into a nightmare, but I couldn't stop myself. The whisper grew louder, leading me past empty rooms and closed doors until I reached a stairwell at the far end of the hospital. And there, scrawled on the wall in what looked like ash, was a single word: cave. The whispering stopped, replaced by a silence so deep it felt like my ears had been stuffed with cotton. I backed away, nearly tripping over my own feet, and ran out of that hospital as fast as I could. When I got to my car, I just sat there, hands gripping the steering wheel, trying to steady my breathing. I don't know what's happening. I don't know what we unleashed or how to stop it, but I think it's not done with us yet. And the worst part, I'm starting to feel that pull again, like it's trying to drag me back to the woods, back to where we buried that board. Maybe it's looking for a new voice, or maybe it's just waiting for its chance to collect. After that day at the hospital, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the word, cave, and the way it had felt like a thread pulling me deeper into a darkness I couldn't see. I started hearing things in my apartment again, that low whisper, but this time it wasn't coming from the closet. It was closer, circling me, like it was trying to get under my skin. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw flashes, images of that shadow, of Jake lying pale in that hospital bed, of the empty woods and the dark pit where the board had been buried. And always that same word echoing in my mind. Harvest. I couldn't take it anymore. I knew I had to go back to the woods. It felt like some kind of unfinished business, like the only way to get any answers. Maybe if I went back to the spot where we'd buried the board, I could figure out what this thing wanted, what it was waiting for. So, one last time, I drove out there, alone, just me and that gnawing fear in my gut. The woods were dead quiet when I arrived. No wind, no rustling leaves, just this unnatural stillness that made my skin crawl. I walked back to the clearing, flashlight in hand, the beam slicing through the shadows. When I reached the spot where the pit had been, I stopped cold. The hole was there, but it wasn't empty anymore. The board had returned, It was half buried in the dirt, splintered and covered in mud, like it had clawed its way back up from the ground. And sitting on top of it was something new, a small weathered notebook, its cover cracked and stained. I knelt down, hands shaking, and picked up the notebook. Inside, the pages were filled with more of that jagged handwriting. But this time, it wasn't just warnings. It was a story about a town, long abandoned, where people used to perform rituals to keep the spirits of the woods at bay. They'd offer sacrifices, use words of power, and if they failed to speak the words in time, the spirits would take something, someone, back with them. One page was marked with a circle, the edges charred like someone had tried to burn it, but couldn't finish the job. In the center, a single sentence was underlined in thick, dark ink. When the harvest comes, it takes its voice. When the voice is taken, it seeks a new one. My mind was spinning, trying to piece it together. Jake and I had called something out, given it a way to speak. But we hadn't taken its voice back before it was too late. Now it was stuck between our world and whatever darkness it had come from, waiting to take what it thought it was owed. That's why it was following us, why it wouldn't let go. And then I heard it. That same whisper, right behind me, but this time it was clear, too clear. Give me a name. I spun around, but there was nothing there, just shadows creeping between the trees. I backed away, stumbling over roots, clutching the notebook like it might protect me. But the whisper came again, insistent, and this time it sounded like Jake's voice, twisted and wrong. Give me a name, and I will let him go. My blood ran cold. I tried to block it out, but the voice was inside my head now, slithering through my thoughts. It wanted a name, my name, I realized. It wanted me to give up my voice, to take Jake's place. And maybe if I did, he'd wake up, the thing would leave us alone. But I knew that if I gave in, if I spoke my name into that darkness, I wouldn't come back. I'd be stuck in that shadow world, a voice for whatever this thing was, while it used me to speak into our world. I dropped the notebook, turned, and ran. The woods blurred around me, branches whipping against my face, roots snagging at my feet. I could hear the whispers chasing me, like leaves rustling in the wind, getting louder and louder until it felt like they were inside my skull, screaming. I don't know how I made it out of those woods. When I finally stumbled back into my car, my hands were covered in dirt, my clothes torn. I slammed the door shut and sped off, not caring if I wrecked my tires on the gravel road. The whispers faded as I drove, but the chill in my bones wouldn't leave. It felt like something had followed me out, clinging to my shadow. When I got home, I collapsed on the couch, gasping for breath, my mind spinning. I thought about Jake, trapped in his coma, about the word we'd failed to say in time. Maybe I was a coward for running, but I knew one thing for sure. Whatever we'd awakened in those woods, it wasn't going to stop until it got what it wanted. It was patient, waiting for me to make a mistake, to slip up, to speak that final word. For now, I've locked every door, every window, and I keep the lights on all night. I haven't gone back to the hospital, haven't seen Jake since that day. I'm afraid if I do, he'll be looking at me with those empty eyes again, like he's already half gone. But I keep checking the news, looking for any sign that he's woken up, or that something else has happened in those woods. Nothing yet, but I know it's out there, biding its time. And last night, when I finally fell asleep for a couple of hours, I dreamed of that pit again, only this time it wasn't empty. I saw my own face staring back at me, lips moving silently, like I was trying to speak, but couldn't find the words. And behind me, in the shadows, there was that shape, just waiting for me to give in. When I woke up, the word CAVE was scrawled on my bedroom wall in black ash. My hands were clean and my door was locked. But I know what it means. It's reminding me that I'm running out of time, that if I don't play by its rules, it'll find a way to take what it's owed, one way or another. I don't know how long I have. I don't know if I'll be able to resist the next time it whispers in the dark, offering me that choice. But if you're reading this, if you ever find a board like ours or hear a voice asking for a name, don't answer it. Don't try to bargain. Because once it knows your voice, it never lets go. We thought the Ouija board was broken until it started moving by itself. So, this is one of those stories where I know I probably should have just listened to my gut from the beginning. But when your best friend's hyped about some late-night adventure, it's hard to be the voice of reason, you know. So, yeah, that's how I found myself on a Friday night, sitting in my friend Jake's dimly lit basement with a dusty Ouija board on the coffee table between us. But trust me, this isn't one of those over-the-top stories where the board flies off the table or some demonic face pops out of nowhere. No, this was way worse because it felt real. Way too real. Now I'd like to think of myself as a pretty rational guy. I don't get spooked easily. But there's something about basements, especially Jake's, that just gives you that uneasy feeling, like the air is heavier, thicker. He swore his basement wasn't haunted or anything, but the place had that old house smell, like it was holding on to secrets. And there were all these old family photos lining the walls, most of them black and white, with those faces that always seem to be staring right through you. You know what I mean? Jake pulled out this old Ouija board from the back of a dusty closet. It looked like it had been sitting there since the 80s, with faded letters and a crack running through the planchette. I joked that he'd found it in a yard sale, but he actually had no idea where it came from. It was just always there, apparently. He said it was probably from one of his uncles or something, but honestly, I could tell he didn't want to dig too deep into that. We brushed it off as a conversation for another time. Now, I wasn't exactly eager to mess with it, but Jake was already setting it up, his eyes lit up like a kid on Halloween. "Dude, it's probably just broken," he said, sliding the planchette across the board. It scraped against the wood, making this horrible screech that set my teeth on edge. He laughed it off, but there was this weird, nervous energy in the room. The kind that makes you feel like maybe, just maybe, you're making a mistake. So we did what you're supposed to do. Put our fingers on the planchette, asked the standard questions, "Is anyone there?" Expecting, well, absolutely nothing. And for the first 10 minutes, that's exactly what we got. Just silence. Jake was clearly disappointed, and I was ready to call it a night. But then he asked, "What if we try something more interesting?" I should have just said no, should have laughed it off, packed up the board, and gone home. But you know how it is when you're with friends. You get caught up in the moment. He suggested asking about the deep web, which seemed dumb as hell to me. I mean, what was a Ouija board going to know about the deep web? But Jake was on a roll, going on about those weird stories people tell online, like how the deep web is some portal to the paranormal or whatever. So, reluctantly, I played along. Jake leaned forward, voice low like we were telling secrets. "What's on the deep web that no one should find?" he asked. I rolled my eyes but kept my fingers on the planchette. It didn't move. Nothing. Just a cold draft that swept through the room, making us both shiver. But then, as if the universe wanted to mock us, the planchette started to slide ever so slightly. I thought it was Jake messing around, but he had that look, wide-eyed, almost freaked out. It spelled out one word, slowly, like whatever was behind it was taking its sweet time. S-E-E-D. We exchanged this look, a mix of confusion and unease. Jake tried to make a joke, but I could tell it rattled him. It didn't make any sense. "Maybe it's talking about some creepy planting ritual or something," he laughed, but his voice cracked a bit. I shrugged, pretending I wasn't bothered, but the words stuck with me. We tried asking more questions, dumb stuff like, "Who are you?" or "What do you want?" But the board stayed still after that. Just a dead silence, like the air was holding its breath. Eventually, we got bored and packed it up, telling ourselves it was just some glitch or maybe one of us unconsciously moving the piece. We tossed the board back into the closet, laughed it off, and spent the rest of the night playing video games, pretending we hadn't just asked some unknown force about the deepest, darkest corners of the internet. But then, when I got home, things got weird, really weird. I turned on my computer to scroll through social media before bed, but there was this new icon on my desktop, a file labeled seed.zip. I don't remember downloading anything like that, and I'm usually careful with random links. It just showed up. I texted Jake, thinking he might be messing with me, but he swore he didn't know what I was talking about. That's when I noticed my webcam light flickering, just for a second. I know, it's probably some software glitch, right? But at that moment, with that cold draft from the basement still lingering in my bones, I felt like I was being watched. I shut my laptop, heart pounding, convincing myself it was just a coincidence. But the unease didn't leave. I tried to sleep, but every creak of the house, every shadow shifting in the corners of my room had me on edge. The next day I wanted to forget all about it, but curiosity got the better of me. I opened the file, and that's when things went from strange to terrifying. I know what you're thinking. Why would you open the file? Trust me, I've asked myself the same thing 100 times. But I think it's that weird mix of curiosity and stubbornness that got me. The way the board had spelled out seed the night before just kept gnawing at me. I wanted to prove it was just a fluke, a glitch. So I clicked on the file. Inside the seed.zip folder, there were 3 files. 2 of them were random strings of numbers, like some corrupted video files or something. The third was a plain text file named instructions.txt. I remember thinking it was probably some virus or malware, another reason I should have just deleted the whole thing. But when I scanned it, nothing came up. No malware, no Trojans, nothing. So I opened the text file. The message was short, barely 3 lines. Plant the seed. Watch it grow. But remember, once it starts, it can't be undone. No sender, no clue where it came from. It read like one of those cryptic messages you'd find on a shady forum. I half expected it to be some kind of prank or an art project by some edgy internet kid. But when I clicked on the first video file, my screen flickered for a moment before going dark. I thought my laptop had crashed. But then a blurry night vision shot flickered on the screen. It looked like a basement. Dark, cluttered, with that same eerie, low-quality green tint you get from cheap cameras. And it was almost identical to Jake's basement. I could see those same creepy old family photos on the walls, just slightly out of focus. The footage panned slowly, the camera wobbling like it was held by an unsteady hand, before settling on the Ouija board. It was the same one, cracked planchette and all. But Jake and I weren't there. The room was empty, and that's when the timestamp caught my eye. 3:33 a.m. That was the exact time we'd been playing with the board the night before. My stomach twisted, and I closed the video immediately, feeling like someone had just doused me with ice water. My hands were shaking as I messaged Jake again, but this time he didn't respond. I stared at the screen, feeling more and more like I was slipping into some kind of bad dream. I needed to know if he'd gotten the same files. I called him, but the line just rang and rang until it went to voicemail. Figuring he was probably still asleep, I tried to brush it off, telling myself I was overreacting. Maybe it was just some kind of auto-generated video, or maybe Jake had set it up as a joke and was waiting to see my reaction. But that didn't explain the timestamp. That timestamp felt like it was mocking me, like someone or something had been there, watching us the whole time. That's when I heard a soft knock at my front door. It was barely dawn, the kind of early morning where everything's tinted in grey. I wasn't expecting anyone, especially not at this hour. The knock came again, louder this time, like whoever was on the other side was getting impatient. I crept down the stairs, each step creaking under my weight. When I reached the door, I peeked through the peephole, half expecting to see some stranger, or maybe even Jake, messing around to freak me out. But there was no one there. My heart was racing. I stepped back, trying to shake off that creeping feeling that crawled up my spine. The doorbell rang, and this time it was long, insistent. My hand hovered over the doorknob, the rational part of my brain screaming, "Don't open it." But I couldn't help myself. I turned the knob and cracked the door open, and lying on my porch in the grey morning light was that same cracked planchette from Jake's basement, perfectly placed on the welcome mat. I felt like my whole body turned to stone. My first thought was to call the cops, but what was I going to tell them? That some board game piece from my buddy's basement had magically appeared on my doorstep after a creepy video showed up on my computer? They'd think I was insane, and honestly, I was starting to feel like it. I picked up the planchette, turning it over in my hand, and that's when I saw the note taped to the back. "We see you." No handwriting, just those words in typewriter font, like it had been printed on some ancient machine. The letters seemed to bleed into the paper, like they'd been pressed down way too hard. I stumbled back into the house, slamming the door shut and deadbolting it. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I felt watched, like there were eyes hidden in every shadow, staring from every corner of the room. I ran upstairs, grabbed my phone, and texted Jake again, but still no reply. My mind was racing, trying to piece everything together, but none of it made sense. The video, the planchette, that creepy message. It was like I'd stumbled into some twisted game that I couldn't back out of. I knew I had to confront Jake, find out what he knew, or at least make sure he was okay. So I grabbed my keys, threw on a hoodie, and sped over to his house. His place wasn't too far, but the drive felt like an eternity, every second dragging on, my mind replaying the events of the morning. When I finally pulled into his driveway, his car was there, but all the lights were off. I pounded on the front door, but there was no answer. That's when I noticed the basement window, the one that looked out onto the driveway, was slightly open. It wasn't like Jake to leave it that way. I took a deep breath and crouched down to peer through the gap. What I saw made my blood run cold. In the dim light, I could just make out the Ouija board, set up right where we'd left it, but the planchette wasn't on the board. It was resting on the floor, pointed directly at the window, like it was looking straight at me. Then, out of nowhere, the basement lights flickered on, and standing in the corner of the room, just barely in view, was a shadowy figure. I couldn't see any details, just a vague shape, but I knew for sure it wasn't Jake. It felt wrong, like it shouldn't be there, like it wasn't supposed to exist. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over my own feet, and as I did, my phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a text from Jake. All it said was, "It's watching us. Don't let it in." I stared at the screen, my breath hitching, but when I looked up, the basement lights had gone dark again. The figure was gone, but the sense of being watched, that wasn't going anywhere. I turned and bolted for my car, the planchette still clenched in my fist, and as I sped away, all I could think was that maybe, just maybe, we'd opened a door that wasn't supposed to be opened, and whatever we let through, it wasn't going to be easy to close it again. I didn't sleep that night. Even after speeding away from Jake's house, I couldn't shake that feeling. The way the figure had just stood there in the shadows of his basement, like it was waiting for something. Jake's message kept looping in my mind, those words practically seared into my brain. It's watching us. Don't let it in. I didn't know what it was, but I was pretty damn sure it wasn't anything good. By the time the sun came up, I'd convinced myself that I had to go back, but not without a plan. I grabbed my old baseball bat from under my bed. Yeah, not exactly a ghost hunting kit, but it made me feel a little less vulnerable. I figured I'd knock on Jake's door until he answered, drag him out of there if I had to. When I pulled back into his driveway, everything looked normal. Too normal. The kind of normal that felt off, like a movie set where everything's perfect on the surface. But you know there's something wrong lurking just out of frame. I got out of my car, gripping the bat tighter than I should have, my palms sweaty against the wood. I knocked on his front door again, but this time I noticed something new. Scratches on the wood, like claw marks, jagged and deep. They hadn't been there the night before. After a few more failed attempts to get him to answer, I went around the back to the basement window. It was still open, but this time a faint light glowed from inside, like a flashlight left on. I called out for Jake, my voice barely more than a whisper, but there was no response. My gut told me to turn back, but instead, I pried open the window and slipped inside. The basement was even colder than before, like the air had a bite to it, sharp enough to hurt your lungs. I crept forward, stepping over piles of dusty boxes and old furniture, until I reached the Ouija board. It was still set up, but something had changed. The board was surrounded by those old family photos, arranged in a circle around it, like they were facing inwards. The faces, already eerie in the dim light, seemed distorted now, like they were warped. And right in the middle of the board was a new note, written in the same typewriter font as the one I'd found on the planchette. The seed is planted. Now, water it. I heard a sound then, a shuffle, like someone moving just out of sight. I spun around, holding the bat up, but there was nothing there. The basement door at the top of the stairs creaked open, just a sliver, enough to let a thin line of light cut through the darkness. My heart pounded in my ears, each beat getting louder, faster. I took a shaky breath, trying to convince myself it was just the wind or the old house settling, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was on the other side of that door, watching me. I was about to leave, get the hell out of there and never look back, when I heard it, a faint, almost childlike voice, whispering my name. Tom. It came from the shadows, somewhere deeper in the basement, like a breeze carrying it right to my ear. I froze, my grip on the bat tightening until my knuckles turned white. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, like my body had locked up with fear. And then the voice came again, softer this time, like it was right behind me. Tom, come down here. I turned, swinging the bat into empty air, the momentum almost making me lose my balance. But no one was there. Just those distorted photos and that damn Ouija board, staring back at me like it was mocking me. The basement was silent again, but my mind was racing, my thoughts tangled in a mess of panic and confusion. I backed up slowly, keeping my eyes on the shadows, and bumped into something solid. I nearly screamed, spinning around with the bat raised, only to find myself face to face with Jake. Or at least I thought it was Jake. He stood there, just at the edge of the flashlight's beam, his face half hidden in darkness. But there was something wrong with him. His expression was blank, eyes unfocused, like he was looking through me. His skin had this ashy, sickly pallor, and his clothes were stained with something dark that I didn't want to think about. He didn't say anything, just stood there, breathing shallowly. Jake, man, what the hell is going on? My voice came out shaky, barely more than a whisper. What did you mess with? He didn't answer, but I noticed his lips moving, forming words too quiet to hear. I leaned in closer, straining to make out what he was saying, and I caught a single word before everything went wrong. Run! His eyes snapped into focus, locking onto mine, and for a second, I saw this desperation in them, like he was fighting something, trying to break free. And then he lunged at me, fingers clawing for the bat, his movements jerky, unnatural, like a puppet on strings. I stumbled back, swinging wildly, and the flashlight clattered to the floor, spinning around and throwing wild shadows across the walls. For a moment, the light caught Jake's face, and I saw something. else in his eyes, something that wasn't him. I managed to break free, bolting up the basement stairs, Jake's footsteps thundering behind me. I threw myself out the back door, slamming it shut behind me, and I swear I heard something else, this low, guttural growl, like there was something with him, something that wasn't human. I ran to my car, heart racing, fumbling with the keys, and when I finally got the engine started, I glanced back at the house. Jake was standing at the window, just barely visible through the basement glass. But he wasn't looking at me. His head was tilted, like he was listening to something, and then he smiled, a wide, unsettling grin that split his face in a way that made my stomach twist. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I floored it out of there, my mind a mess of terror and confusion. When I got home, I locked every door, every window, but I knew deep down that it wouldn't matter. Whatever we'd messed with, whatever we'd let in, it wasn't just in Jake's house anymore. It had followed me. That night, I tried to piece it all together, replaying everything in my mind. But every time I thought about that message, plant the seed, watch it grow, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. It was only beginning. And the worst part, I could still hear that whisper, echoing in the back of my mind, like it had rooted itself inside my thoughts. Water it. After I got back home, I tried everything to convince myself that what I'd seen wasn't real, that Jake had been messing with me, that I was just overreacting. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The way he moved, the look in his eyes, the way his smile twisted. It wasn't something you could fake. And that whisper, that thing that had followed me out of his basement, seemed to cling to the edges of my thoughts, like a dark cloud I couldn't shake. For the next few days, I barely left my room. I didn't eat, didn't sleep, just kept my laptop open, desperately searching for any explanation, any similar stories. But everything I found only made things worse. The forums I stumbled into were full of rumors, stories about entities that crossed over through digital spaces, things that used the deep web as a kind of gateway. People wrote about cursed files, strange messages, but nothing felt concrete. Nothing felt like it would help me stop whatever this was. I tried calling Jake again, but every time, the line was dead. And when I drove by his place, it looked abandoned, like no one had been there in days. His car was still parked out front, but all the windows were dark, blinds drawn tight. I wanted to go back inside, to check on him, but the memory of that shadowy figure was too fresh, too raw. And then, one night, things escalated. It was around 2 a.m. when my laptop screen flickered to life by itself. I'd left it open on my desk, but I hadn't touched it for hours. The screen glowed against the darkness of my room, that same seed.zip file icon appearing in the center. But this time, a chat window popped up next to it. The username was just a series of numbers, something like 404-799. The message itself was simple, but it felt like a lead weight in my chest. Plant it before it takes root in you. My hands went cold, fingers hovering over the keyboard. I typed back, my mind racing. Who is this? What do you want? Almost immediately the response came. Plant the seed or it will grow inside. I felt a chill run through me. I was about to type back, demand answers, but the message window closed by itself, disappearing into the void of my desktop. The seed.zip file icon pulsed once, like it was alive, and then vanished too. I shut my laptop, heart racing, trying to ignore the creeping sense that something was burrowing deeper inside me. I started feeling this constant pressure in my chest, like a weight that wouldn't lift. And sometimes, when I closed my eyes, I could almost hear it, a faint, rhythmic scratching, like claws against wood, coming from somewhere deep inside my mind. The next day, I tried to get some fresh air, thinking maybe I just needed to clear my head, but it followed me outside too. I kept catching glimpses of movement out of the corner of my eye, like shadows flitting just beyond my vision. When I turned to look, there'd be nothing there, but I knew. I knew it was watching. That evening, I got a call from an unknown number. Against my better judgment, I answered it, hoping maybe it was Jake. But all I heard was static at first, crackling through the speaker. And then, beneath the noise, there was that voice again, whispering my name. Not like before. It was clearer this time, more deliberate, almost like it was savouring each syllable. "Tom, you're running out of time." I hung up, heart pounding, and threw my phone across the room. It shattered against the wall, but even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still listening somehow. Watching, growing. Desperation started to take over. I pulled out the Ouija board from where I'd hidden it under my bed. I thought maybe, just maybe, if I tried to contact whatever it was, I could bargain with it, find out what it wanted. I set the board up on my desk, lit a couple of candles. Probably dumb, I know, but I'd seen enough horror movies to think that maybe the ambience would help. I put my fingers on the planchette, that same cracked one that had shown up on my doorstep. My hands were shaking so bad that the piece jittered across the board. I took a deep breath and asked the one question that had been haunting me since all of this began. "What do you want from me?" For a long moment, nothing happened. The basement-like chill filled the room, the flames of the candles flickering violently. And then, slowly, the planchette started to move. It scraped across the board, spelling out one word: soil. I didn't understand at first, but then the next letters came, dragging painfully across the board. Like whatever was moving, it wanted me to feel every inch of that horrible grinding motion. BURYIT. My mind raced, trying to piece together what it meant, but all I could think of was the phrase from that cursed text file. Plant the seed. Watch it grow. It wanted me to bury something, but what? The planchette stopped moving, but the room seemed to close in around me, like the shadows were thickening, pressing in from every corner. I tore my hands off the board, knocking it to the floor, and that's when I noticed my reflection in the mirror across the room. I could barely recognize myself. Pale, drawn, dark circles under my eyes. But what really sent a jolt through my veins was the shadow standing behind me. It was just a vague shape, like a trick of the candlelight, but its head was tilted, like it was curious. And then I realized it wasn't a shadow. Its reflection moved, but when I turned around, there was nothing there. I grabbed the Ouija board, the planchette, and the note, and stuffed them into a backpack. If burying it was what it wanted, I was going to do it. I didn't know if it would work, or if I was just walking into some trap. But anything was better than feeling that thing crawling inside my mind. I drove out of town, to a spot near the woods, where no one would think to look. By the time I got there, the sky was darkening, the sun just a sliver over the horizon. I pulled out a shovel from the trunk and dug a hole as deep as I could manage, throwing in the board, the planchette, everything that had anything to do with this nightmare. The whispers grew louder, urging me on, like they were leaking out of the shadows themselves. When I finally buried it all, I filled the hole with dirt and pressed it down with my foot, feeling that pressure lift just a bit, like whatever was inside me was loosening its grip. For the first time in days, I let out a shaky breath, feeling a sliver of hope. But as I turned to leave, I noticed something half buried in the dirt nearby, just peeking out from the shadows of the trees. It looked like an old typewriter, rusted and covered in soil. Its keys were still intact, each one bearing a thick black stain that looked suspiciously like dried ink. Or maybe something else. I wanted to turn away, but my feet moved on their own, pulling me closer, my mind screaming to stop. As I knelt down to get a closer look, I realized that the paper roll inside wasn't blank. It had a single word typed over and over, all the way down the page. Water. And then, beneath that, in fresh, wet ink, "It's not done yet." I stumbled back, nearly tripping over my own feet as I turned away from that rusted typewriter. The word water echoed in my head, pounding in time with my heartbeat, like it was demanding my attention. My whole body felt cold. That kind of bone-deep chill you can't shake. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't satisfied with what I'd done. It wanted more. The trees around me seemed to twist and bend, their branches clawing at the sky, casting long shadows that stretched across the forest floor. I fumbled with my keys, practically throwing myself into my car, desperate to get out of those woods. But even as I sped down the dirt road, the image of that typewriter stayed burned into my mind, like a brand I couldn't shake. By the time I got back to my house, the sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving only a thin strip of orange light bleeding into the night sky. I locked every door and window, drew the blinds, trying to shut out whatever was outside, but deep down, I knew it wouldn't be that easy. I collapsed onto my couch, my breath coming out in ragged gasps, trying to think. What did it mean? Water. Was it just trying to mess with me, keep me tangled up in its game? Or was it a warning, something I needed to do? The thought of going back out there, digging up that cursed board, made my skin crawl, but the sense of unfinished business gnawed at me. I needed a drink, something to calm my nerves, so I went to the kitchen, but as I turned on the faucet, the water sputtered and coughed before running dark. At first I thought it was rust, but then I caught the smell, iron and something else, metallic and sickly. I gagged, shutting it off, but the water kept dribbling from the tap, staining the sink a deep crimson. That's when I heard it again, the faint whisper, like a voice carried on the breeze, seeping in from every corner of the house. Water it, or it will consume you. I froze, the words slithering through my mind, and then my phone buzzed on the counter, making me jump. It was another unknown number, and this time, the message was a picture. My heart clenched as I opened it, my fingers trembling. It was a photo of Jake's basement. No mistaking those old, dusty walls. But the board wasn't there anymore. Instead, in the center of the room, there was a deep hole, surrounded by muddy footprints, leading off into the darkness. And then the second message came through, just one word. Thirsty? I dropped the phone, my hands shaking so badly I could barely think straight. I wanted to believe it was a trick, but I knew this thing wasn't playing games anymore. It was getting impatient, pushing me to the edge. And if I didn't do what it wanted, I had no doubt it would take something from me. Maybe everything. I grabbed the nearest jug of water and headed out, back into the night, back toward the woods. My head spun with 1,000 thoughts, each one darker than the last. But one thing was clear. Whatever was tied to that Ouija board, it wasn't done with me. It wanted to grow. When I reached the spot where I'd buried the board, the ground looked disturbed, like something had clawed its way out from beneath. The dirt was damp, darker than the rest, and in the moonlight, I could just make out the outline of the typewriter, half covered in earth. It looked older now, rust flaking away like dead skin, its keys jammed with wet, clotted mud. With a deep breath, I unscrewed the cap of the water jug and poured it over the spot. The water seeped into the ground, disappearing into the soil, but as it did, the air grew colder, sharper, biting through my hoodie like a freezing wind. The earth beneath me seemed to shift, settling, like something beneath the surface had moved. And then I saw it. A hand, pale and thin, reaching up through the mud. I stumbled back, nearly dropping the jug. The hand twitched, fingers curling against the soil like they were testing it. And then another hand broke through, clawing its way up. My mind screamed to run, to get the hell out of there, but I was frozen in place, unable to look away as something pulled itself free from the ground. It wasn't Jake, and it wasn't human. It was something else. A twisted, distorted shape that seemed to bleed shadows, its body made up of the same darkness that clung to the edges of my thoughts. It stood, hunched and unnatural, its face a blank void that seemed to ripple like water, shifting between features that I almost recognized. My face, Jake's face, faces I'd seen in the old photos on the walls. It moved toward me, silent, its limbs bending at impossible angles, its head twitching like it was listening to something only it could hear. The air was thick with the stench of rot and mud, and I could barely breathe, my chest tightening with each step it took. I clutched the bat, raising it in front of me, but the thing just tilted its head, like it was amused. "Is this what you wanted?" I shouted, my voice cracking in the stillness. "What the hell are you?" For a moment, it paused, and I thought maybe, just maybe, it might answer. But then, without warning, it lunged at me, its hands grabbing my wrist with a grip like ice. Pain shot through my arm, a burning, searing cold that spread through my veins, and I dropped the bat, gasping as the shadows poured out from its body, wrapping around me like smoke. I don't remember how long it lasted. Seconds, minutes, maybe hours. All I knew was that when the thing finally let go, the world had changed. The woods were silent, and the night air had lost its chill. I fell to the ground, clutching my chest, struggling to breathe as I looked up at the place where the creature had been. It was gone, vanished back into the shadows, but the ground where it had stood was charred and blackened, like a burn that went down deep. And as I knelt there, catching my breath, I realized that the pressure in my chest had eased. The whispers had faded, leaving only a dull, empty silence. But I knew better than to believe it was over. The message on the typewriter still burned in my mind. "It's not done yet." When I finally made my way back to my car, I found one last note stuck under the windshield wiper, written in that same typewriter font. "Congratulations, you've watered the seed." There was no signature, no explanation, just those words. But as I drove home, feeling the shadows lurking at the edge of my vision, I realized that whatever I'd done, whatever I'd set free, it wasn't going to stop. It wasn't in the board anymore. It wasn't in the woods. It was in me. And the worst part? Sometimes, late at night, I hear it again. Just a whisper. So faint, I almost think I'm imagining it. But I know better now. It's waiting for me to listen. The Ouija board gave us the location of a hidden room in the house. We should have left it sealed. Alright, so this happened about a year ago, but it's still messing with my head. I moved back into my childhood home after my mum passed away. My brother Mike and I inherited it, but I got the short straw and ended up living there. It's one of those older houses, creaky floorboards, tiny little attic, your standard creepy family home. We'd always heard the occasional noise as kids, but, old houses have a way of making you think they're haunted. Anyway, a few months in, my buddy Danny came over one night. We were bored out of our minds, scrolling through Netflix and finding nothing. After a couple of beers, we ended up digging through the old junk in the basement, and that's when we found it, an old Ouija board. It looked ancient, the kind with the wooden planchette and faded letters. The thing had been tucked behind a dusty stack of boxes that hadn't been touched in years. I don't remember ever seeing it before, and it wasn't like my mum was into that kind of stuff. "Dude, this thing looks legit," Danny said, brushing the dust off. He was always into paranormal stuff, even back when we were kids. I wasn't too keen on it, but like I said, we were bored, and I figured, why not? We set it up on the coffee table in the living room, the only part of the house that didn't feel like it was straight out of a horror movie. At first, it was just a lot of us joking around, asking dumb questions like, "Is anyone here with us?" and "What's my favourite beer?" Nothing happened. But then Danny, with a serious look on his face, asked, "Is there something hidden in this house?" That's when the planchette moved. Now I know what you're thinking. One of us was pushing it, trying to mess with the other, but I swear it glided so smoothly, so precisely, spelling out yes. I laughed it off, thinking Danny was just trying to scare me, but then it spelled out a location, a TTIC. I remember rolling my eyes, but Danny was all in. "Come on, man, we gotta check it out," he urged. I figured I'd humour him, but part of me, just a small part, was curious too. I mean, I had lived in that house most of my life. and I never knew of anything interesting in the attic. It was just a cramped space full of old holiday decorations and dusty photo albums. The most exciting thing I'd ever found up there was a box of my old baseball cards. So we grabbed a flashlight and headed up. The stairs creaked with every step, and the air grew colder as we neared the top. The attic door was stiff, like it hadn't been opened in years. We finally forced it open, and that familiar smell of dust and old wood hit us immediately. Danny shone the flashlight around, and I was starting to regret coming up here. It was chilly, and the shadows seemed to stretch in odd ways with the dim light. We didn't see anything at first, just the same old junk. But then Danny spotted something. "Yo, what's that?" He pointed the flashlight at the far corner, where the wooden floorboards looked different, like they'd been replaced at some point. There was a square cutout that was clearly meant to blend in with the floor, but once you noticed it, you couldn't unsee it. "Man, I've never seen that before," I muttered. The thought that the Ouija board might have actually pointed us to something made my skin crawl, but I wasn't about to show it. Danny, on the other hand, was practically buzzing with excitement. We pried up the loose floorboard, and beneath it was a small wooden hatch, locked with an old, rusty padlock. It was the kind of lock you'd see in a mystery movie, covered in dust and spider webs. The strange thing was, the wood around it looked newer than the rest of the attic, like someone had sealed it up not too long ago. But there was no way my mum would have done that. She barely made it up the stairs, let alone into the attic. "You think it's just storage?" Danny asked, but his voice was shaky, betraying the unease we both felt. I didn't want to admit it, but I was getting that feeling, you know. Like when you're walking home at night and swear you hear footsteps behind you, but when you turn around, there's nothing there. I shrugged and pulled out my toolbox from the shelf nearby. It took a bit of work, but we finally broke the padlock, the rusted metal snapping with a sound that seemed too loud in the silence of the attic. We pulled open the hatch, revealing a set of narrow stairs leading down into the dark. Danny and I stared at each other for a moment, the reality of what we were doing starting to set in. But curiosity is a powerful thing, and, well, we'd come this far. The stairs led to a small room, barely more than a crawl space, really. The air down there was thick, like it hadn't been disturbed in decades, and there was this smell, like old leather, and something else I couldn't quite place, something metallic. Danny shone the flashlight around, revealing a dusty wooden desk, an old chair, and shelves filled with yellowed papers. It looked like someone's study, hidden away where no one would think to look. Danny picked up one of the papers and skimmed it. "It's just a bunch of notes, weird symbols, some scribbled words. It's all gibberish." He tossed it aside, disappointed. But then I noticed something carved into the wall, just above the desk. It was a word, etched deep into the wood. "Leave." It was probably just some weird prank my dad or my uncle pulled when they were younger, right? But standing there, in that musty hidden room, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us, something that didn't want us there. Danny must have felt it too, because he muttered, "Maybe we should head back up, man." But then the flashlight flickered and died, plunging us into complete darkness. And that's when we heard the noise. A slow, rhythmic tapping coming from the corner of the room, like someone drumming their fingers against the wood. My breath caught in my throat. "Danny, that you?" I whispered, my voice barely holding steady. But I already knew it wasn't him. He was standing right beside me, frozen like a statue. That's when I realized, whatever we'd disturbed, it wasn't happy about being found. My heart was racing. I couldn't see a thing in the pitch-black room, and Danny's silence wasn't helping. The air felt thicker down here, pressing in around us, and I swear it was colder too, like the hidden room had its own temperature. The sound, that slow, deliberate tapping, echoed through the dark, seeming to come from every corner at once. "Danny," I whispered, trying to keep my voice steady. "This isn't funny, man. Turn on your phone light or something." Danny fumbled with his phone, the little click of the power button breaking the silence. Nothing. It was like the dark swallowed up every ounce of light we tried to produce. I reached for my own phone, but my hands were shaking so badly that I nearly dropped it. When I managed to switch on the flashlight, the beam was weak, barely cutting through the darkness. But it was enough to see Danny's face, pale, wide-eyed, not at all like the guy who was so eager to explore a few minutes earlier. That's when the tapping stopped. Everything went dead quiet, the kind of silence that makes your ears ring. We stood there for a second, straining to hear anything, hoping it was just some trick of the old house settling. But then, from somewhere deeper in the shadows, came a sound I'll never forget. A low, raspy whisper, like someone forcing words through dry lips. "I warned you." It wasn't loud, but it hit me like a punch to the gut. Danny's flashlight suddenly flickered back to life, casting wild shadows across the walls. And that's when I saw it, just for a second, something hunched in the far corner of the room, its back turned to us. It was pale, almost too pale, like it hadn't seen daylight in decades. Its fingers, long and bony, drummed against the floor in that same rhythmic tapping. Before I could react, Danny grabbed my arm, his grip like a vice, and we bolted. We scrambled back up the narrow stairs, nearly tripping over each other in our panic. As we burst through the hatch into the attic, I pulled it shut behind us and shoved an old metal toolbox over it. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. But the attic was silent again, like nothing had ever happened. Danny was pacing back and forth, his face pale under the dim light. "What the hell was that, man? Did you see it? Tell me you saw it," he stammered. But I couldn't answer. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I'd just seen, or thought I'd seen. Maybe it was a trick of the light. Maybe it was a shadow playing tricks on us. I kept telling myself that, trying to shove down the cold fear creeping up my spine. But that voice, that whisper, I couldn't shake it. We locked the attic door and headed downstairs, not even bothering to clean up the Ouija board. It felt like every corner of the house had eyes now, watching us, waiting for us to mess up again. Danny tried to laugh it off, saying it was probably some weird old insulation making noises, or maybe a raccoon got trapped down there. But I could hear the tremor in his voice. Neither of us really believed that. I didn't sleep that night. Every little creak in the house made me jump, and I kept expecting to hear that tapping again. By morning, Danny decided he'd had enough. He said something about being late for work, but I could tell he just wanted to get out of the house. Before he left, he muttered, "Maybe you should get a priest or something, just in case." I tried to laugh it off, but the thought stuck with me. The whole day, I kept thinking about the hidden room and that thing in the corner. I knew I should just forget about it, pretend like we never found that stupid hatch. But there was this nagging feeling, like I'd left a door open that should have stayed locked. That night, it got worse. I was lying in bed, trying to convince myself that everything would be fine, when I heard it. The faintest sound coming from the ceiling, right above my room. Tap, tap, tap. My heart dropped into my stomach. It was the same rhythm, the same slow, deliberate pattern from the hidden room. I held my breath, straining to hear, hoping it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. But it got louder, like something was moving across the attic floor, dragging itself toward the hatch we'd sealed. I thought about calling Danny, but what was I going to say? "Hey man, remember that thing we saw? Yeah, I think it's in my attic now." I knew how crazy it sounded. I sat there, clutching my phone, every muscle in my body tense, praying for the noise to stop. After what felt like hours, it did. The house fell into silence again, but I knew that whatever we'd let out of that room wasn't going to stay hidden. Not anymore. The next morning, I found scratches on the inside of the attic door, deep and jagged, like something had tried to claw its way out. There was no way Danny could have done that. He'd been with me the whole time, and besides, the scratches were wrong. Too wide, too deep, like something with hands bigger than a human's had tried to break through. I didn't know what to do. I thought about just leaving, packing up my things and never looking back. But this was my family home. I couldn't just abandon it over some noises in the night, right? That's what I kept telling myself anyway. I decided to seal the hatch for good. Bought new locks, nailed some wooden planks over it, even put a heavy old dresser on top. But that night when I went to bed, I heard the tapping again. Closer this time, like it was right beneath the floorboards, listening to me. And that whisper, coming through the darkness like a draft through a crack in the window, chilling me to my core. You should have left me alone. The next few nights passed in a blur of restless sleep and creeping dread. I'd go to bed with the lights on, clutching my phone like it was a lifeline, listening for any hint of that tapping or the whisper that seemed to float through the walls. And every night, without fail, the noise would start up again. Sometimes it was distant, like it was pacing back and forth in the attic. Other times, it seemed to come from right beneath my bed, making my skin crawl. I'd sealed the hatch. I'd locked it, reinforced it, blocked it with furniture, everything I could think of. But deep down, I knew it wouldn't matter. It wasn't just the attic that felt wrong anymore. It was the whole house. Shadows seemed darker, stretching longer in the corners of every room. Sometimes, when I walked past the hallway mirror, I'd catch a glimpse of something behind me, just a flicker of pale skin, or a shadowy figure standing too close. But every time I turned around, there was nothing there. The worst part, the scratches. They started spreading. It was subtle at first. A few faint marks on the baseboards, like some small animal had been scraping at the wood. But then I noticed them in places that didn't make any sense. Long, jagged gouges running down the length of the hallway walls, like something with claws was trying to get out. They were all heading in the same direction, leading back toward the attic door. I tried to ignore it, tried to convince myself it was just some structural damage or an animal that had gotten inside somehow, but the marks were too deliberate, too precise. One morning, I found them on my bedroom door, deep and uneven, as if something had been trying to claw its way into my room while I slept. My stomach dropped when I saw them. Whatever it wasn't just stuck in the attic anymore. I called Danny, hoping he'd have some kind of explanation, or at least tell me I wasn't losing my mind. He picked up on the third ring, sounding groggy and annoyed. "Look, man, I don't know what to tell you," he muttered after I explained everything. "You're probably just freaking yourself out. It's an old house, right? Wood creaks, animals get inside, stuff happens. But if it's really bothering you that much, I'll come over, all right?" It was a relief to hear him agree. As much as I hated admitting it, I didn't want to be alone in that house anymore. We set a time for him to come over the next evening, and I spent the rest of the day doing everything I could to avoid being inside. I walked around town, grabbed food, anything to stay away until it got dark. When I got back, Danny was waiting on the front porch, tapping his foot impatiently. He gave me a look, one that said he thought I was overreacting, but he didn't say it out loud. "All right, let's take a look at this," he sighed, stepping inside. We went straight up to the attic. I half expected the hatch to be open again, but everything looked the same as I'd left it. Locks, boards, the heavy dresser pushed on top. Danny took one look at it and raised an eyebrow. "Dude, you went all out with this, huh?" "Yeah, well, I thought it'd help," I mumbled, my eyes darting toward the scratches on the floor nearby. Danny knelt down, running his fingers over the gouges in the wood. "Okay, this is kinda weird. I'll give you that," he admitted. He tried to pry up one of the boards, but they held fast. The locks were still intact, the hatch sealed tight. "So, what do you think?" I asked, hoping he'd come up with some rational explanation, something to make it all make sense. But before he could answer, there was a sound from downstairs, a dull thud, like something heavy had just hit the floor. Danny shot me a look, his confidence wavering for the first time. What was that? I shook my head, too scared to speak. We crept down the stairs, my hands trembling so badly I could barely hold the flashlight steady. The noise came again, louder this time, echoing up through the floorboards. It sounded like something was dragging itself across the living room. We reached the bottom of the stairs, and that's when we saw it. A dark smear stretching across the wooden floor, leading from the base of the stairs toward the back of the house. It looked like something had been dragged, leaving a trail of thick, dark liquid in its wake. I felt a wave of nausea hit me, and I fought the urge to bolt out of the front door and never come back. Danny leaned down to touch the trail, then jerked his hand back, his face twisted in disgust. "What the hell is this?" he whispered. The liquid was thick and dark, with a metallic scent that filled the air. It wasn't blood, at least I hoped it wasn't, but whatever it was, it reeked of decay. The trail led back toward the basement, the same place we'd found the Ouija board in the first place. I could see the door hanging slightly open, creaking on its rusty hinges. Danny hesitated, glancing at me. I knew what he was thinking. The logical thing to do was to leave, to call the cops, maybe even burn the whole damn house down. But instead, I found myself pushing the basement door open wider, the old wood groaning under my hand. The basement was darker than I remembered, like the shadows were thicker somehow, pressing in around us. The trail of that dark, sticky substance led down the stairs, disappearing into the blackness below. I took a deep breath, steeling myself, and we stepped down, the floorboards creaking under our weight. We reached the bottom, and Danny shone the flashlight around the room. That's when I saw it, an old, mouldy mirror leaning against the far wall, covered in dust and grime. It must have been hidden behind the same boxes where we'd found the Ouija board, but now it was out in the open, reflecting the dim light back at us. For a second, I thought I saw something moving in the reflection, something pale, shifting just beyond the edges of the light. I turned around, expecting to see someone standing there, but there was nothing. I faced the mirror again, and my heart skipped a beat. In the reflection, I could see the attic hatch, open, but when I turned to look behind me, it was still sealed, the dresser sitting on top of it. I blinked, trying to make sense of it, but then something in the reflection moved closer, stepping out of the shadows. It was the same hunched figure, its head tilted at an unnatural angle, its eyes sunken and hollow. And this time, its mouth stretched into a wide, unnatural grin. Before I could react, the thing reached out toward the mirror, its long, bony fingers pressing against the glass. I grabbed Danny's arm, but he didn't seem to see it. His flashlight was pointed somewhere else, oblivious to the thing creeping closer in the reflection. I tried to shout, to warn him, but the words stuck in my throat. I could only watch as the figure's fingers tapped against the glass, tap, 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 in that same rhythmic pattern. Then, with a sound like cracking glass, the mirror shattered and the flashlight died, plunging us into darkness. And in the dark, I heard the whisper again, closer than ever. "You can't keep me locked away." When the mirror shattered, everything seemed to collapse into chaos. Shards flew everywhere, glinting in the flashlight's final beam before we were plunged into absolute darkness. Danny cursed under his breath, fumbling with his phone to get some light. But all I could focus on was that whisper echoing in my head. "You can't keep me locked away." In the pitch black, I felt something brush against my arm, cold and dry, like a draft slipping through an open window. My breath caught, and I jerked back, bumping into Danny. He grabbed my shoulder, his grip tight, and whispered, "We need to get out of here now." I didn't need any convincing. We stumbled back up the basement stairs, tripping over each other in our desperation to escape. The air felt thicker than before, clinging to my skin, making every breath a struggle. And just as we reached the top of the stairs, something slammed the basement door shut behind us, hard enough to rattle the walls. Danny and I exchanged a look, the fear plain on his face. He tried the doorknob, but it wouldn't budge. like something was holding it closed from the other side. Panic surged in my chest. We pounded on the door, shouting for help, but our voices just echoed back at us, muffled by the heavy wood. The house seemed to shift around us, the floor creaking and groaning like it was coming alive. And then I noticed it, those same dark smears from the basement, trailing up the walls, dripping along the ceiling. They twisted and curled, forming strange symbols, jagged spirals and crude shapes that seemed to pulse in the dim light of my phone. Danny backed away from the door, his hands shaking. "This is all wrong, man. It's like the whole place is changing." He turned to me, his voice dropping to a desperate whisper. "We never should have messed with that thing. We never should have opened that hatch." I nodded, trying to keep my breathing steady, but my mind was racing. We had to find another way out. The windows in the living room were our best bet. They were old, probably easy enough to break through. But as we moved deeper into the house, the air grew colder, and that same rhythmic tapping started up again, this time from the direction of the kitchen. Tap, tap, tap. My skin crawled. I grabbed Danny's arm, trying to pull him toward the living room, but he shook his head, his face pale. "We have to see what it is, just for a second. Maybe it's trying to tell us something." I wanted to argue, but he was already moving toward the kitchen, the floorboards creaking under his steps. I followed close behind, my hand gripping the back of his jacket like a lifeline. As we crossed the threshold, I realized the kitchen had changed too. The cupboards hung open, doors creaking on their hinges, and the air smelled sour, like something rotten was festering just out of sight. The flashlight flickered back on for a moment, casting a weak beam across the room, and I froze. There, standing by the old wooden table, was the hunched figure. But now it faced us, its hollow eyes locked onto mine, its grin stretched impossibly wide. It raised one hand, fingers tapping against the edge of the table. Tap, 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 as if mocking us. Danny tried to speak, but his voice came out as a choked gasp. What do you want?" The thing's head tilted, that smile never faltering, and in a voice that sounded like 100 dry leaves rustling together, it whispered, "You invited me. Now I stay." Suddenly the lights in the house flickered on and off, faster and faster, until the bulbs shattered one by one, plunging us back into darkness. And in the dark, I heard the creak of the attic door swinging open upstairs, followed by a slow, dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled across the floor. Danny bolted, heading for the living room, but I found myself rooted to the spot, staring into the darkness where that thing had been. My mind was screaming at me to run, but my legs wouldn't listen. I heard Danny shouting my name, his voice growing distant, like he was calling from the end of a long tunnel. And then, just before the last bulb went out completely, I saw it again, its face inches from mine, the grin so wide it seemed to split its skull. I could feel its breath, cold and foul, like dirt and decay, washing over my skin. It whispered one final time, the words barely more than a rasp against my ear. "You can't keep me out." I snapped out of my trance, stumbling backward, and ran toward the living room, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Danny was by the window, using a chair to try and smash through the glass, but every swing just bounced off, like the window had turned to solid steel. "It's not working, man! It's not working!" he shouted, his voice cracking with panic. I grabbed another chair and joined him, hitting the glass with everything I had, but it wouldn't even crack. It was like the house had trapped us, sealed us inside with whatever we'd brought out of that hidden room. And then we heard it, the creak of footsteps on the stairs behind us, slow and deliberate, each one heavier than the last. We turned, our flashlights casting jittery beams across the hallway, catching glimpses of pale skin and hollow eyes peering at us from the shadows. It was coming closer, the air growing colder with each step, and I could feel that grin, even in the dark. Danny grabbed my arm, pulling me toward the front door, but when we reached it, the handle wouldn't turn, the door wouldn't budge, like it was glued to the frame. We tried everything, kicking, shoving, but it was useless. The footsteps were nearly at the bottom of the stairs now, and that horrible smile seemed to follow us wherever we moved, no matter where we turned. Desperation clawed at my chest. I knew we had to do something, anything, to get away from that thing. But then I remembered the Ouija board, still sitting on the coffee table where we'd left it. Maybe if we could put it back, close whatever door we'd opened, we'd have a chance. I rushed over, my hands fumbling over the smooth wooden surface, and grabbed the planchette. Danny was beside me, his breathing coming in harsh, uneven gasps. "What are you doing?" "We need to... Trust me," I snapped, dragging the planchette across the board. Come on. Just say goodbye. Just end this." But before we could move the planchette to goodbye, the board jerked under our hands, the planchette dragging itself across the letters with a force that nearly pulled my wrist out of its socket. It spelled out one word, clear and precise. Stay. The air grew colder, the shadows longer, and the whispers swirled around us like a winter wind. Danny's flashlight went out again, and in the darkness, I felt the icy grip of those bony fingers on my shoulder, pulling me back. I tried to scream, but the sound died in my throat, swallowed by the darkness. Danny's flashlight blinked back on for a split second, casting a weak, flickering glow across the room. I caught a glimpse of his face, eyes wide, mouth open in a soundless scream, and then darkness swallowed us again. The grip on my shoulder tightened, cold fingers digging into my skin, pulling me back toward the shadows that had taken over the house. I fought against it, twisting and thrashing, but it was like trying to escape a vice. Danny tried to pull me free, but something unseen yanked him back, slamming him into the wall with a force that knocked the breath out of him. I heard him hit the floor, gasping, but I couldn't see anything. The darkness pressed in from every direction, filled with that whispering voice, all around me, inside me. "You should have left it buried, but you asked, and now I am here." I could feel the thing's breath against my neck, colder than ice, and I felt my knees buckle beneath me. The planchette slipped from my hands, clattering against the Ouija board, and in the silence that followed, the house seemed to hold its breath. I forced myself to speak, my voice barely more than a shaky whisper. What do you want?" The whispers stopped, and for a moment, the darkness itself seemed to lean closer, as if considering. When the voice returned, it was clearer, more focused, dripping with something almost like amusement. "You let me out, but I am not free. I am bound to this place, to the hidden room, to the shadows you disturbed. I can offer you a choice." I couldn't see Danny, but I could hear his labored breathing beside me, feel the tension vibrating through the air. My mind raced, trying to understand, to find a way out. "What choice?" I forced out, the words scraping against my dry throat. The grip on my shoulder loosened, just a fraction, and I heard the slow drag of that thing's fingers against the floorboards, circling us, drawing out every second like it was savoring the moment. "You stay," it whispered, voice echoing through the room, bouncing off the walls. "You stay, and you will take my place, bound to this house, to the shadows. Or you leave, and the house remains mine, but one must stay." The words sent a shiver down my spine, colder than anything I'd felt before. I turned to where I thought Danny was, fumbling in the dark until my fingers brushed against his arm. He clutched my hand tightly, his grip shaking. I could feel the panic radiating off him, mirroring my own. Don't listen to it, man," Danny choked out, but I could hear the fear in his voice. "It's lying. It's trying to trick us." But the truth was, I didn't know if it was lying. I didn't know anything anymore. And in the silence that followed, I realized something. If we didn't make a choice, if we didn't do something, the thing wouldn't let either of us leave. We'd be trapped here, forever, stuck in the dark with whatever had been buried in this house. I squeezed Danny's hand, trying to convey some kind of comfort, some assurance that I didn't feel. "We'll find a way, all right? We'll figure this out. I whispered, but I could hear how hollow it sounded. The thing in the darkness seemed to laugh, a sound like dry leaves scraping across the floor. And then the grip returned, dragging me backward, pulling me toward the stairs. My feet scraped against the floor, my fingers slipping out of Danny's grasp, and in that moment, I knew. I knew it was done playing with us. It was going to take one of us, whether we chose or not. But just as I felt myself being dragged back into the shadows, Danny lunged forward, grabbing the Ouija board off the table. He held it out in front of him like it was a shield, his voice breaking as he shouted, "Let him go! Take me, all right! Take me instead!" The air went still, so silent I could hear the blood pounding in my ears. I felt the grip on my shoulder loosen, then vanish completely. I collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath, as the shadows seemed to shift, coiling around Danny like smoke. "Danny, no!" I tried to shout, reaching for him, but he shook his head, forcing a weak smile. "It's okay, man. It's gotta end, right? Someone's gotta stay. Better me than you." The thing's voice returned, softer now, almost gentle. "One must stay." Before I could say another word, the shadows surged forward, wrapping around Danny, pulling him back toward the basement stairs. His face twisted in pain, but he didn't scream. He just looked at me, his eyes wide and terrified, mouthing something I couldn't hear. And then he was gone, swallowed by the darkness, dragged back into the depths of the house. I lay there, numb, my mind struggling to process what had just happened. The air grew warmer, the shadows receding, and the lights flickered back on, casting harsh, artificial light across the living room. The house seemed normal again, like whatever had been lurking in the corners had retreated, content with the price it had taken. I forced myself to stand, my legs trembling, and stumbled toward the basement. The door swung open easily now, no resistance, no whispering. I called Danny's name, my voice echoing down the empty stairs, but there was no answer, only the soft drip of water from some unseen pipe, the air stale and empty. I knew, deep down, that I wouldn't find him, that he was gone, taken by whatever had been hidden in that room, lost in the shadows I'd disturbed. I should have felt relief, but all I could think about was that smile, those hollow eyes, and Danny's face as he vanished into the dark. I left that night, packed a bag, got in my car, and drove without looking back. The house is still there, sitting empty on the edge of town. Sometimes, when I can't sleep, I wonder if anyone else will find the Ouija board, buried under the dust and shadows of the past. If they'll hear that whispering voice, offering them the same choice. I hope they have the sense to leave it alone. But I know how curiosity works. I know how the darkness draws you in, makes you think you can outsmart it, escape it. And I know what happens when you ignore the warnings. As for me, I hear it sometimes when I'm alone in my new apartment. That soft, rhythmic tapping, drifting through the walls. Tap, tap, tap. Just faint enough to make me doubt my own ears. And in those moments, I can almost hear that voice again, carrying a promise I'm too afraid to face. You can't keep me out.